Hello and welcome to Buy the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert, and today we continue and conclude our study of Josef Pieper's Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. In our previous episodes, we talked about, first of all, the nature and the significance of words, or the word, as Pieper calls it, in terms of human nature. As rational animals, we are naturally drawn to find the truth and then to communicate the truth. And when we turn away from that and we misuse words to misrepresent reality, we are not only deceiving people, but we're also damaging our own nature. We're degrading ourselves by doing that. And this is the essence of the critique of what Pieper is calling sophistry, which is the refined, highly educated, highly sophisticated manipulation of words for purposes of misrepresenting reality. Then we continue to look at where does Pieper find this in the modern world. The three main areas that he discusses are advertisement and entertainment, and finally propaganda. So of the three, the most obviously damaging of those is propaganda. And we think about, propaganda is a form of manipulation in which, violence is being threatened or at least implied. And we can all see, the problem with that. But part of the essence of what propaganda is, which he looks at, is that even though it is threatening people, sort of forcing people to go along with a certain agenda, it's also trying to present that as reasonable and good. And the arguments perhaps are not really sincere or really credible, but they're sort of a fig leaf that enables us to pretend like we really believe this and we really were voluntarily going along. And this all points back to the nature of human dignity being based in the word. So even when we are surrendering our dignity as human beings, we don't want to admit that, and we want to pretend that we're not doing it. And this is part of what the art of propaganda is doing, is giving us a chance to misrepresent, even to ourselves, what we're really doing when we cave in and go along with something that's not right. And looking back, we can see, therefore, with advertising and entertainment, that these things, the abuse of language in these areas is not as innocent as it may seem. Just with advertising, we all think we're smart enough not to fall for the tricks of advertising, but Pieper says, why do they bother spending that much money on it? It's not because they're so stupid they're wasting their money. It's because people are influenced by this more than they want to admit. But even more significantly, he says, what does it mean that we accept it as normal? We accept advertising as a normal part of life, even when we see that it's so frequently misrepresenting things. We're already surrendering some of our dignity just by going along with that, even if we think we want to kid ourselves that we're above it. And with entertainment, here, I think the big thing is that we don't really see it. We don't realize what's happening. We think we're just being entertained and it's so, fun or absorbing or whatever it may be. But if we think about how the world is being presented to us in this entertainment, or what part of our own soul, our own being, is being entertained and is being flattered by this entertainment, is it helping us to understand the world better and to be our best selves, or is it bringing out the worst in us? And he looks at, a long and nuanced list of the different kinds of vices that entertainment and media can actually stimulate. And so it's more than just sex and violence. There's many different ways that entertainment and media can basically make us worse versions of ourselves, bring out the worst in us as we become habituated into allowing ourselves to be entertained and informed through these means. So today we're going to look at some further thoughts about the way that words are corrupted in modern society, and specifically what can or should we do about this, according to Pieper. And before we get into solutions, there's one more aspect of the problem that I want to look at here briefly. And this goes to, again, trying to dig a little deeper than what we usually think about. Because we're well aware of certain aspects of these problems, but we don't necessarily think deeply enough about them sometimes. And here, the example I would bring is the idea of misinformation or related type concepts, that we often hear it said that in modern media, modern society, we have a problem of misinformation. And that may be true, but Pieper here reflects on the fact that framing things in terms of information is itself part of the problem. And here's why. He says it is entirely possible that the true and authentic reality, and remember, that's what the word is for. The word is to connect us to reality. This reality is being drowned out by the countless superficial information bits, noisily and breathlessly presented in propaganda fashion. So it's tied into his discussion of propaganda, but notice it isn't necessarily because the information is false. That's not his complaint in this paragraph. That our connection to reality is being drowned out by this inundation of superficial bits of information. What he's getting at here is that information is not the same thing as wisdom. Information is not the same thing as actually encountering reality itself. And so there's something deeper and more profound about actually reflecting on the nature of things and getting an insight into the nature of things. It goes beyond simply having facts or images or whatever that show us, things about reality. So even if it's not misinformation, it could be hyperinformation. It's too much information, basically. Consequently, one may be entirely knowledgeable about 1,000 details, and nevertheless, because of ignorance regarding the core of the matter, remain without basic insight. So we could spend a lot of time in digging into what Pieper probably means by the core of the matter here. But, the simple version is that there is something beyond just knowing, memorizing the phone book or knowing the facts about this or that. There is something that gets into understanding the actual meaning and purpose of things. Just like he says the word exists so that we can encounter reality and we can communicate reality, things have a character, things have a nature, they have an essence, they have a purpose. If we aren't familiar with that, then we're lacking in wisdom. And no matter how many facts we know or how much information we have, it doesn't enable us to make sound judgments about what is good or bad or right or wrong. This is a phenomenon, he says, in itself already quite astonishing and disturbing. So it's the way our lives are framed. They're framed around information to the extent that we're neglecting the deeper philosophical questions. So even if all the information were factually correct, this would be downgrading our intelligence. It would be robbing us of perhaps even the awareness that we need to think more critically and reflectively about the nature of things. Arnold Galen labeled it a fundamental ignorance created by technology and nourished by information, an ignorance nourished by information. So this is a crucial thing here. He connects it to propaganda, but notice that it doesn't have to be false. It just has to overwhelm us to the point where we don't ask the most important questions anymore. And that in itself makes us much more manipulable because we're less critical minded in the most important sense of good and bad, right and wrong. Of course, once that happens, then it is much easier to slip in actual false information. People have less of a concrete sense of reality against which to compare it. I would say also the extent to which we're living in media rather than living in real life, and that we're looking at real life through the lens of the media that we're inundated in, then it makes it easier for us to be manipulated and to, in fact, live in a kind of virtual reality, which is where Pieper goes next. But I wanted to say, he says, something far more discouraging is readily conceivable as well. The place of authentic reality is taken over by a fictitious reality. My perception is indeed still directed toward an object, but now it is pseudo-reality, deceptively appearing as being real. So much so that it becomes almost impossible anymore to discern the truth. So if we're so habituated into living through media, living through artificial representations of reality, it becomes harder and harder for us to actually distinguish truth from falsehood because we're living in a pseudo-reality. Even to the extent it's accurate, it may be accurate, but we can't verify that for ourselves anymore. So when it departs from reality, we're less able to notice that. For the general public, is being reduced to a state where people not only are unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable even to search for the truth because they are satisfied with deception and trickery that have determined their convictions, satisfied with a fictitious reality created by design through the abuse of language. Now, this is something that we associate with technology, and rightly so. Technology makes what Pieper is talking about so much easier, and the technologies of today are much more advanced than they were in the 1970s when he's writing this. And in the 1970s, they were already more advanced than, say, in the 1870s or the 1770s. But I would point out in this course that, what Pieper is outlining here is something that we already saw outlined in a favorable light by Machiavelli in The Prince. This is precisely how Machiavelli is recommending that the people be dealt with, to keep the people satisfied and stupefied, right? And Pieper's repeating this satisfied here. The people are satisfied with what? They're satisfied with a pseudo-reality, which means, and stupefied literally means unable to speak. But notice that that's, symbolically, that's a corruption of the word, a corruption of our relationship to reality. So this is precisely what Machiavelli was recommending, that the people be kept in a state of satisfaction based on a pseudo-reality, based on an artificial reality that is imposed by the prophet, the prophet prince, who can just sort of recreate the world through whatever belief system he's imposing. And so this is precisely what Pieper thinks is happening in the 20th century going into the 21st century. So what do we do about it? In order to respond in the healthiest way to this, and I think this is anytime we're looking at, a critique of modern society or any kind of a negative, focus, here's what's wrong with the world kind of thing, the point that Pieper is making here, some version of this is a really important, inoculation as we look at this, which is that he says Plato is not simply taking an anti-sophist stance. He certainly is. There's a vigorous critique of the sophists. They're corrupting the word. They're corrupting the most important thing about human nature and human life. But it's not, the opposition to that is not the fundamental point, right? And this is true of any kind of negative stance. The ultimate justification for any negative stance is something positive and good that is being defended or promoted. It's being protected from whatever we have to oppose. So what we're opposing is a threat to the good, but what is the good that it's a threat to? That's what we should ultimately be looking at, how to promote that good. Otherwise, we can oppose, sophistry or oppose any negative thing all day long, but if we don't know what the good is that we're trying to promote, then there's no point in fighting against that negative thing. More decisive is the intensity of his prior positive affirmation, talking about Plato. His unwavering, strong opposition can fully be comprehended only in view of his own position regarding the overriding importance of the good that is endangered and threatened by the sophists. So we'll see when we study St. Thomas Aquinas that this is very fundamental, that it's natural and good for us as human beings to oppose evil. We are wired for that, to be able to fight against evil, but it's always for the sake of promoting a good. Evil is not the thing that we should be defining our existence. It's only an incidental, accidental, you could say, thing that obstructs the good. So anytime we find that we're in that kind of oppositional stance, as we should be towards sophistry, the most helpful thing is to look beyond that towards the positive good that we're trying to promote. So in going back to the positive good and articulating this, one of the things that Pieper is doing here that's significant is that he's suggesting that we need to look at, Plato as a guide to the philosophical good, but we also need to bear in mind that it's not just the highly educated, not just those who might study Plato or might also be roped into the sophistry, but it's everyone who, one way or another, can and should cultivate this relationship to the truth. All men are nurtured first and foremost by the truth, not just philosophical types like Pieper and maybe like some of us who are making or watching this podcast. Everybody has a fundamental orientation to the truth. The natural habitat of truth is found in interpersonal communication. So it's the way that we all relate to one another. So how are we going to cultivate this love of truth? Truth lives in dialogue, in discussion, in conversation. It resides, therefore, in language, in the word. Consequently, the well-ordered human existence, including especially its social dimension, is essentially based on the well-ordered language employed. So we all obviously associate with each other. Now, if we find that we're not having conversations and we're not discussing important things with other people, this is where people are saying this should be a focus. And don't just complain about the media, complain about propaganda, complain about advertising, complain about Hollywood, whatever. Think about your own existence. With whom do you converse? And what do you talk about? What are the topics of your conversation? What is the quality of that conversation? Is it a well-ordered, language that you're cultivating and you're employing? Are you trying to get to a deeper understanding of things in the actual conversations that you're having with people around you? A well-ordered language here does not primarily mean it's formal perfection. So it's not a question, do you use a lot of big words? Do you use a lot of fancy, phrasing and stuff like that? So what are you discussing, and are you trying to understand it better? And if you are developing your vocabulary, which is a good thing for all of us to do, are you doing it for purposes of clarity and understanding? Because, the good use of language, part of what you see is that sometimes there's a word for something, and there's a particular word for something. And if you don't know that word or you can't remember it, then it's harder to accurately, distinguish a particular phenomenon. So the better you understand things, then the more you realize the vocabulary matters, because it's actually making distinctions about reality that are important to make. If everything's a thing, for example, you can't really describe anything because everything's a thing. So the more you know about something, then the more you're going to use that differentiated, language. But, there's the over sophistication that he's been warning about. When you're not making distinctions for the sake of understanding, you're making the distinctions for the sake of deliberately confusing or misleading people. That's totally different. So both of those could be a problem. Your language could be under sophisticated because you don't have the vocabulary you need to describe things, but your language could be over sophisticated because you're making distinctions for no real purpose or no good purpose. So both of those would be against the well-ordered language that he's talking about here. It's measured by reality. No, a language is well-ordered when its words express reality with as little distortion and as little omission as possible. So this is something that I think, part of it would be tested by simply thinking, what do I talk about? How do I talk about this? But at the heart of this is our heart. Where is my heart in this? What is my desire? What is my motive? Am I talking about things with the motive of, say, like complaining and venting? Am I talking about things with the motive of getting ahead, impressing people? Am I talking, there's a variety of different motives I might have. Is my fundamental motive that I want to know the truth and I want to share that truth with other people? That's what he's really been getting at in this essay. That is the best and the only truly human motive. We do need other things, we need, to make a living and so forth. But is the foundation of our discourse, our use of language, that we want to know the truth about things and we want to communicate that with others. Each of us can focus on that regardless of any other factors. I don't want to say regardless of other people around us, because actually, if you look at the way he's framing this, it's much more important to think about this in terms of your family and your friends and your coworkers, people that you interact with on a more regular basis, rather than to look at society as a whole, where at most you're probably a more passive kind of participant in, absorbing certain media rather than actively being a part of that discussion. But going beyond just the general relationships that we have, there are some special kinds of environments and contexts in which we can particularly cultivate our desire for truth and our ability to pursue the truth. And Pieper, being an academic, he's already told us that being in academics is by no means a guarantee that one is being philosophical, that every professor or student or administrator, anybody dealing with higher education, as we call it, is tempted to be a sophist. They're tempted to manipulate words for their own advantage. However, the existence of academia, why does it exist? Both historically, but in terms of the nature of the thing. Pieper insists that, the term academic, as he says here, expresses something that remained unchanged throughout the centuries, something that can be identified quite accurately. So it has an intrinsic meaning to it. It means that in the midst of society, there is expressly reserved an area of truth, a sheltered space for the autonomous study of reality, where it is possible, without restrictions, to examine, investigate, discuss, and express what is true about anything. A space then explicitly protected against all potential special interests and invading influences, where hidden agendas have no place, be they collective or private, political, economic, or ideological. Now, is Pieper saying that this is true, that universities are like this, or academic, anything that's academic is going to be like this? No, in fact, it's really the opposite. He's saying this. Remember, he had been warning us. He's gotten to the positive part of his essay where he's saying, what can we do about it? So he's already warned us that academia can be and is frequently infected with sophistry. But here he's saying the whole reason that we have academia is the only reason that we should even care about whether it exists or not, is that it is a place for the pursuit of truth. That is its purpose. And so for those who are involved in academia, this is a reminder and kind of a rallying cry that this is a space which should be carefully protected for purposes of encountering reality. Any special interests, any kind of influence, open or hidden, that would be distorting reality in any way should be avoided. That doesn't mean it couldn't be a topic of discussion. In fact, just as he's discussing in this essay, he's discussing sophistry. That would be a very useful thing to do in academia, is to think about how and why these things are distortions, how and why they are not good ways of encountering reality. But this is the specific nature and purpose of academia. So beyond the sort of general advice for the general person in society, he's particularly advising those who are involved in academia to remind them that this is what it's for and to make every effort to steer it in that direction. Continuing on that note, he says, academic must mean anti-sophistic, if it is to mean anything at all. Now, this is, it's a bold statement because, today academics, for example, could be associated with many professions, with different kinds of research connected to technology. In other words, useful products can come out of this. But part of what people are suggesting is that there's no essential connection there. So all those things could be done without having to have universities, right? You can have research labs, you can have, all that kind of stuff. You could argue that, having the academic pursuit of certain kinds of knowledge is in the long run going to provide a greater impetus, a better foundation for those more practical oriented enterprises. But Pieper is insisting that that is not the reason that universities exist. If it were, they would be a different kind of thing. And if that's the direction it ends up going, then they will be a different kind of thing. That won't really be what they originally were supposed to be. And he is, of course, defending the original meaning of academic and suggesting that it is most important of all. Those practical benefits that come from technology and other knowledge, practical knowledge that comes out of higher education, they all can be good in certain ways, although sometimes they can also be harmful, right? So that's a whole different discussion. What's good or harmful about different technologies and different techniques that come out of those studies. But the problem that he's focused on here is sophistry. And so the solution for that is the pursuit of truth. And this is the unique purpose of academia compared to any other institution or organization in society, is that it is there simply for the pursuit of truth. Opposition is required, for instance, against every partisan simplification, every ideological agitation, every blind emotionality, against seduction through well-turned yet empty slogans, against autocratic terminology with no room for dialogue, against personal insult as an element of style, all the more despicable the more sophisticated it is, against the language of evasive appeasement and false assurance, and not least against the jargon of the revolution, against categorical conformism and categorical nonconformism. So I mentioned earlier that Pieper he doesn't squarely focus on political issues in his essays, but he is always reminding us of the political implications. In this case, he's writing this in the 70s. So if you think about what happened to higher education, both in America and Europe in the 1960s, for example, and the rise of a mostly left-wing radicalism in the universities. Clearly, Pieper is protesting against this here. He's saying that this is not the purpose of universities, to be a platform for political ideology and the propaganda and the pressure tactics, the personal insult as an element of style, trying to tear down people who have different beliefs or ideas about things because they're not going with the program. The idea of appeasing certain groups and people while vilifying others, all of that is contrary to the nature and purpose of higher education. So the extent that today that we still are concerned about these kinds of ideological influences in the universities, we can see that Pieper would be saying, yes, we have to be in complete opposition to that. It's a completely separate question of what we happen to think, what our own political views might be, or what we think is, is a reasonable or just, policy or program in the political realm. But regardless of what we think about those political issues, we need to see that within society has to have a place for the pursuit of truth for its own sake without any other agenda. And that has to be policed and regulated like anything else, because people can and will violate that for their own purposes. But, does Pieper himself, is he trying to come up with some other, agenda to fix these problems? Of course, that could be what follows, right? He could say, here's how we're going to get this cleaned up, and we have to do X, Y, and Z. But he declines from that. And so I want to end by thinking about how and why he declines to go that way. Is it, an evasion on his part, that he just doesn't want to take responsibility for, fixing the problem? Or is there a better explanation? He says clearly none of these challenges can easily be translated into the organized approach of practical action. So it would be hard. Okay, so that's one thing he's suggesting. Not that it's impossible, but that it would be difficult. It's not. He's not accepting that task in this essay, and I would say in his work as a whole, he doesn't try to develop practical organizational plans, for improving on the issues that he calls attention to in his works. As the threat is elusive, Plato's experience throughout his life, so also are the means to resist it. So he kind of leaves it at this. He says, the threat is an elusive one. He had said earlier, the better the sophist is, the harder it is to tell that this person is a sophist in the first place. So just like with Plutarch saying the best defense against flattery is to govern one's own soul and to pursue truth and virtue, and the more devoted one is to that, then the less likely one is to be manipulated by others. This is also the platform on which Pieper is building. The most significant practical advice that comes out of this essay is that each one of us has to really check our motives and check our behaviors, our habits, our virtues and vices. And we have to see how we can personally grow in our relationships, personal and professional lives, and so forth, so that we are more deeply committed to truth and to expressing that in what we do. And there's really no other basis for, political or social reform. Doesn't mean he's not categorically denying that, legislation or policy could be relevant, because depending on the details of different things, legislation or policy could be beneficial or harmful. It could be encouraging good or bad behavior. He's not a political scientist, and he doesn't focus on those kinds of details. But philosophically, I think the crucial point is that there is no legislation or policy that can get to what he called the heart of the matter, the core of the matter, right? Because the heart and the core of the matter is our own hearts, our own souls. What we really care about, what we're really striving for, what we really prioritize in our lives. And so he's saying, yeah, sure, if necessary, then look at these kind of broader, social and political, organized approaches that might be helpful, but don't pin your hopes on those things. The threat will always be here. There always will be abuses of language. And on the other hand, there always is the potential for using language well. Both of those things are universal and always present. So the most significant thing for each of us is to cultivate that love of the truth in every possible way that we can, and to bring that into all of our different relationships and encourage others to do the same. And by doing that, we are each of us making our maximum contribution to the common good of society.